The shooting hadn't started yet. No gun was raised, no threat was spoken out loud. But one man in the room was already dead, not because he had made a move, because someone else had made a decision. And that someone was Lucky Luciano. Most people think violence decides outcomes, that whoever shoots first controls the ending. But in this moment, the ending had been locked in long before the first shot echoed. Luciano wasn't reacting to chaos, he was shaping it. He understood that if bullets were allowed to decide freely, the result wouldn't be justice or dominance, it would be uncontrolled war. Too many grudges, too many men eager to prove something, too many deaths that would demand more deaths in return. So Luciano did something colder. He didn't ask who deserved to die. He asked whose death would end the problem. One life, one outcome, one sacrifice that would close the door instead of blowing it off its hinges. By the time the shooting began, the choice had already been made, not by chance, not by rage, but by calculation. This is what separates raw violence from real power. Anyone can pull a trigger. Few can decide which trigger pull actually matters. Luciano didn't need chaos to win. He needed precision. And once that precision was applied, everything else, the fear, the silence, the obedience, fell into place automatically. Because when one man controls who dies before the gunfire starts, the shooting itself becomes secondary, almost ceremonial. The real danger isn't the bullet. It's the decision that comes first. Long before anyone reached for a weapon, the room was already unstable. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense in the way only experienced men recognize. Every person present understood that this situation could not end cleanly on its own. Too many reputations were involved. Too much pride had been invested. If the shooting started without control, it wouldn't stop with one body. It would spiral outward, retaliation, miscalculation, and eventually a war no one in New York was prepared to survive. This was the environment Lucky Luciano walked into. Not a sudden ambush, but a slow-burn confrontation where every option carried risk. If he tried to defuse it publicly, he would look weak. If he allowed both sides to act freely, the result would be chaos disguised as justice. And if he picked a side openly, he would inherit their enemies along with their loyalty. Luciano understood something critical. Once guns are drawn, control disappears. Bullets don't respect hierarchy. They don't stop when the right person falls. They create momentum, and momentum in the Mafia world is deadly. That's why the most important decisions had to be made before anyone moved. Not during the shooting, not after, before. This wasn't about punishing guilt or rewarding loyalty. It was about outcome management. Luciano wasn't asking who had caused the problem. He was asking how the problem could be ended permanently. That required accepting an uncomfortable truth. Someone was going to die regardless. The only question was whether that death would close the situation or rip it open. Letting fate decide was not an option. Fate is inefficient. Fate creates martyrs and misunderstandings. Luciano needed finality. A death that would be understood immediately, interpreted correctly, and, most importantly, not challenged afterward. The wrong body on the floor would invite revenge. The right one would freeze it. This is why, before the first gun was even visible, the situation had already shifted. Luciano wasn't waiting to see who acted first. He was deciding whose action would matter at all. The shooting hadn't begun, but the conclusion was already forming, quietly, inside one man's calculation. And once that calculation was finished, the rest was just noise. The decision wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, and it wasn't driven by anger. When Lucky Luciano chose which man would die, he wasn't thinking about punishment. He was thinking about containment. In that room, several men could have fallen, but only one death would actually end the situation instead of multiplying it. Luciano's calculation followed a brutal logic. The man selected couldn't be powerful enough to spark a vendetta, but he also couldn't be insignificant. A nobody's death would mean nothing. It would look like panic, or worse, cowardice. The death had to carry weight without carrying momentum. It had to send a message without inviting a reply. Status mattered. Alliances mattered. But timing mattered more. Luciano understood how quickly stories form after blood is spilled, who people blame, who they expect to answer back. The wrong death would force explanations. The right death would eliminate the need for them. That's what made the choice so cold. It wasn't about who deserved to die. It was about whose death would be accepted as final. The man Luciano chose was exposed in a very specific way. Protected enough to be visible, but not protected enough to be avenged. Important enough to be understood, but isolated enough to be absorbed. Once that choice was made, the rest of the room became irrelevant. Everyone else, whether they realized it or not, had already survived. This is the part most people misunderstand. Luciano didn't choose a victim to demonstrate cruelty. He chose one to prevent repetition. One death that stopped 10 others from becoming necessary. One outcome that made escalation irrational. The sacrifice wasn't random, it was precise. By the time anyone else sensed what was happening, it was already too late to change it. The balance had shifted. The moment a single man is selected to die before the shooting begins, the shooting itself loses its unpredictability. Chaos is replaced by inevitability, and once inevitability takes hold, resistance collapses. Not because of fear, but because everyone understands that the decision has already been made for them. Once the choice was made, Lucky Luciano didn't need to manage the violence itself. He only needed to ensure it stopped where he intended. That's why one death was enough. Not because the situation was small, but because it was fragile. In moments like this, excess force doesn't strengthen authority. It exposes insecurity. Luciano understood a rule most men with guns never learn. Multiple deaths create questions, not solutions. Every extra body demands explanation. Every unanswered explanation turns into a reason for revenge. The more blood spills, the more people feel entitled to respond. That's how confrontations turn into wars. Luciano wasn't trying to scare the room. He was trying to close it. The single death he had chosen carried a complete message on its own. It clarified who had crossed the line. It demonstrated that boundaries existed, and most importantly, it told everyone else that escalation would not be rewarded with chaos or opportunity. It would be met with finality. No theatrics, no follow-up, no space for interpretation. This is where the power of precision reveals itself. When violence is limited, it looks intentional. When it's intentional, it looks controlled. And when it's controlled, people stop testing it. The men who survived didn't feel spared. They felt instructed. They understood exactly why they were still standing and what would happen if they forced another decision. Luciano didn't need to threaten the rest of the room because the logic was already visible. If one death could end everything, then another death would only reopen it, and no one wanted to be responsible for that. Silence became safer than reaction. Acceptance safer than defiance. That's why the shooting, when it came, didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like punctuation. A period placed at the end of a sentence Luciano had already written. Nothing more was required. Nothing more was allowed. And once that lesson was absorbed, the men who walked out alive did so knowing something chilling. The next time a situation reached this point, the outcome wouldn't be decided in the heat of the moment. It would be decided long before anyone touched a gun. When the shooting finally started, it didn't unfold like a battle. There was no scramble for advantage, no cascade of gunfire, no moment where control slipped from anyone's hands. It happened quickly, almost clinically, exactly the way Lucky Luciano had anticipated. The man who was meant to die fell. And then, just as importantly, nothing else happened. That absence of escalation was the real outcome. No second target moved. No retaliatory shot followed. No one tried to finish anything. The room absorbed the death the way a system absorbs a necessary loss. The men who were still standing didn't look relieved, and they didn't look angry. They looked corrected. Because the shooting hadn't created a new situation, it had resolved an old one. This is where Luciano's control became unmistakable. The violence didn't rewrite the balance of power. It confirmed it. Everyone present understood that the event had been bounded in advance. The shooting wasn't an opening move. It was a conclusion. The boundaries were clear, and no one dared cross them because crossing them would mean forcing Luciano to choose again. And that was the real deterrent. What changed wasn't who held power, but how power was understood. After that moment, nobody believed outcomes were decided by nerve, speed, or numbers. They were decided upstream, quietly, invisibly, and long before confrontation turned physical. The gunfire was just the mechanism by which that decision became visible. In the aftermath, there was no celebration, no victory claimed. There didn't need to be. The lack of reaction spoke louder than any warning ever could. The system had proven it could eliminate a threat without unraveling itself. That stability mattered more than dominance. The shooting ended quickly, but its effect didn't. It reset expectations. It taught everyone watching that when Luciano allowed violence, it would be limited, purposeful, and final. And when violence stopped, it stopped completely. Nothing about the surface seemed different. But underneath, everything had shifted. The men who walked away knew they hadn't witnessed chaos. They had witnessed a decision being enforced. After the shooting, there was no victory to claim and no score to settle. That was intentional. The moment worked precisely because it didn't invite interpretation. Everyone involved understood that what had happened was not a contest. It was a correction. And corrections don't require celebration. They require acceptance. This is where Luciano's power revealed its final form. He wasn't controlling men in the room anymore. He was controlling future behavior. From that point on, every confrontation carried an invisible prelude. Has the decision already been made? Men stopped thinking about how far they could push. They started thinking about whether they had already been evaluated. That shift matters. Power based on fear needs constant reinforcement. Power based on certainty does not. Once people believe outcomes are decided upstream, they stop testing the system. Not because they're weak, but because resistance feels pointless. The shooting didn't make Luciano look dangerous. It made him look inevitable. And inevitability is far more effective than intimidation. No one rushed to fill the gap left by the dead man. No one tried to reinterpret the event in their favor. There was nothing to spin. The message was complete. One death had closed the situation exactly as intended. Anything more would have reopened it. Anything less would have undermined it. The precision was the proof. From that day forward, confrontations involving Luciano followed a different logic. They didn't escalate toward violence. They stalled long before it. Because everyone knew that if a situation reached the point of gunfire, the outcome wouldn't be negotiated in the moment. It would already be decided. And being on the wrong side of that decision meant there was no appeal. That's the kind of authority that doesn't rely on presence. It doesn't require shouting, threats, or demonstrations. It operates quietly, shaping behavior before it becomes visible. The shooting was just the last step in a process that had already concluded. And once people understand that someone can choose who dies before the shooting starts, they stop thinking in terms of battles. They start thinking in terms of outcomes. And outcomes in Luciano's world were never accidental. The most dangerous moment in this story was never the gunfire. It was the silence before it. The moment when lucky Luciano decided that one life would end so everything else could stop. By the time the shooting happened, the outcome wasn't uncertain. It was executed. That's the kind of power history struggles to recognize. Not the power to pull a trigger, but the power to make the trigger irrelevant. Luciano didn't dominate the room with noise or numbers. He dominated it by defining the consequences in advance. One death, chosen precisely, carried more control than a dozen random bodies ever could. And once people understand that outcomes are decided before emotions take over, behavior changes. Confrontations stall. Ambition recalculates. Violence loses its leverage. The room learns that escalation won't create opportunity. It will only force a decision that has already been made. So when people ask how Mafia power really works, they usually look at the wrong moment. They look at the shooting. They look at the body. They look at who fired first. But the real story happens earlier, when someone decides who won't walk out alive and why. Because in the end, the deadliest act isn't pulling the trigger. It's choosing the ending before anyone hears the shot.